Welcome to A Lawyer's Guide to the Galaxy, a podcast about geek culture by lawyers, with your hosts, Ben Siders and Kirk Damon. Today's episode is brought to you by the X-71 Independence. 4 million pounds of fuel, 1 nuclear weapon, and 270,000 moving parts built by the lowest bidder.
And welcome back, everybody, to A Lawyer's Guide to the Galaxy. Once again, I am your host, Ben Siders. The man sitting across from me is Kirk Damon.
That's Kirk, as in the captain of the Enterprise?
Yes. So we actually had somebody ask why Kirk says that at the beginning of every episode. Kirk, I'll throw that one to you.
Yeah, that's actually something I started doing a while ago, and it's so that people know how to spell it, because I've discovered that when people, I tell them that, they spell it correctly, whereas in most cases they tend to spell it K-U-R-T.
Yeah, they think you're Kurt.
Yeah, and as much as I might be appreciate being attached to potentially, an old St. Louis Rams quarterback or certain actors, it doesn't really spelled right.
Yeah, exactly. So today's topic is going to be an everyday legal concept, at least it's everyday to attorneys, but something you, if you're not a lawyer, may not be aware of. It's called I don't know how to pronounce this.
Force majeure.
Force majeure. It's a law French term. I know people usually think law terms are all Latin, but we actually borrow a lot of legal terminology from French, and it's all butchered and anglicized and spelled terribly and pronounced wrong. So
and we mispronounce it.
Yeah, and so it's called law French. But a force majeure basically means superior force. Sometimes in American law we call these acts of God.
Now, why we're talking about acts of God is because, well, it's a few weeks ago when you guys are listening to this, there was this sort of major event which occurred in the United States, and in particular occurred over St. Louis, called an eclipse.
Yeah, so if you were living under a rock, literally living under a rock, you would not have noticed.
Yeah, but you probably did notice it otherwise, and that's where we kind of did it. And I have to admit, my immediate take upon seeing the eclipse, we went down to the Endangered Wolf Center and saw it down there. And, one of the things that was kind of cool about it is thinking about what this would have looked like to a culture that didn't have the eclipse glasses. So you wouldn't have actually seen anything because you couldn't look at the sun up until totality occurred.
Yeah, I took my kids down to a park down in Festus to see it, and I'd never seen anything near a total eclipse. We've seen a partial one, and I put seen in air quotes because there's really not much to see if you don't have something to look at it with. And you're right, if you imagine being, ancient peoples who don't have any way to look at this, you probably wouldn't notice anything until it was, I don't know, about 80% covered. It started to kind of change the lighting a little bit.
Yeah, one of the things we definitely commented about, and it's, and I'll joke about this as to what it is. I was an undergraduate physics major, so obviously it was the sort of science astronomy nerd.
I was an English major. I have no excuse.
One of the things that we definitely got into, in conjunction with it was just the way the light changed and the fact that everything looked different.
It looked like right after it rains at first.
Yeah, it's kind of a weird, sort of occurrence. And you start to feel like something's not right. And it really is kind of an occurrence thing. And so, as I sort of said, the subtitle of this episode is the End of the World episode.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about the eclipse inspired this topic and, how things like that, big events that are, acts of God or just things that happen in nature beyond anybody's reasonable control, interact with the law.
Yeah, what actually happened if the sun got swallowed?
Yes. So in law, force majeure usually refers to a description of a type of event or circumstance beyond anybody's control, and the legal effect of a force majeure is that it excuses people from having to perform certain contract obligations that are rendered impossible by the occurrence of the event.
Yeah, and it may make some sense to give us just a few basic contract terms for you guys who are out there. And this is stuff you're going to get in sort of Contract Law 101. The first one of which is basically, what is a contract?
Yeah, there's a lot of misconception about this. I've had people tell me, look, I've got a copy of the contract here, I'm going to rip it up and now it's no good. Like, no, you just destroyed evidence is all you've done.
Yeah, exactly. This contract still exists. And I think the way I've always sort of put it is it's a contract's an agreement. And I remember my contract law professor telling me, that that's a lot of what you would encounter in conjunction with contracts is it's any kind of agreement.
Yeah.
The key point about it is it's an agreement that the law thinks is enforceable. So there's lots of, you can just have an agreement where the law would look at it and say, no, that's not enforceable. So you can't agree to do something illegal, for example.
Exactly right. And that's the key concept behind a contract, a legally enforceable exchange of promises. And it must be bargained for. You can't just gratuitously offer to do something and somebody says, okay, that's just a gratuitous offer. So if I've got a pen in my hand right now and I say, Kirk, I'll give you this pen for $1, Kirk says, okay, now we have a contract because we've agreed to an exchange of services, basically. He gets a pen, I get $1. But if I say, I'll just give you this pen and he he says, fine, I'm not obligated to do anything.
Yep, and that's the legal word in that, and what gets used is the term consideration.
Consideration, yeah.
And
what must be something offered in exchange.
Yeah, and that's essentially what it is that each party has to get some value out of the contract in order for there to be a contract. Now, consideration can be a relatively minor concept. It can be something which is, in some sense, not physical. I mean, the examples of ones, in IP law we bump into is the exchange of goodwill. So the idea of an association of, hey, you have this knowledge of this association
Well, you remember
with
back in like the 90s and everybody was doing Columbia House and all that kind of stuff to get get 15 CDs for a penny?
I did that for like 4 years in college.
Why the penny? Because there has to be some consideration or form of contract. That's why all these contracts say in exchange for good and valuable consideration of $1. Everything's for sale for $1. So that's what the consideration is for. Now, once you have a contract, if you fail to perform, then you can be sued for failure to perform.
Yep.
And in American law, we don't usually just make people perform contracts if they don't. Instead, our preferred remedy is something called damages, which is a fancy legal word for money.
Yeah. I mean, there can be other damages outside of money, but yeah, the thing you primarily get into is the recognition in the United States law that basically says, look, we're not going to force you to do something. I mean, it starts to sound like indentured servitude at that point in time.
The liberal tradition, generally looks down upon forcing people to do things. Now, there are cases where you can, but those aren't going to be relevant here.
Yep.
The reason this all matters in the context of force majeure is if you don't perform, but it's because of a force majeure event, then you can't be sued. Oh, you can be sued, but you have a defense. You would say, well, I couldn't perform. So let's look at a couple of examples that may tease this out a little bit more. So to establish a force majeure excuse for non-performance, the failure to perform has to be caused by the event, obviously.
Yep.
The event has to be unexpected and unavoidable. And the event also has to be reasonably beyond your control as a person who didn't perform, and you couldn't have prevented its consequences. So, we've got sort of a situation down in Houston right now, a lot of force majeure going on down in Houston.
And I think that's one of those things where you can look at and say natural disasters is one of those things that generally gets used as sort of a law school example of what is a force majeure. Now, because of the fact that this is a science fiction and nerd-based podcast, we're going to talk about things like alien invasion, asteroid collision with the Earth, things like that, just because those are a lot more fun.
Yeah. So a couple of examples on the difference. So suppose you're a software engineer, you're working on a project, say, for a customer, and after working for an entire day, you never bothered to save your work, and the power goes out for a few seconds, and you lose it all.
Yep.
This has actually happened to me, which is probably why I'm not a software engineer anymore. Is this a force majeure event? Well, pretty straightforward. Was your failure to perform inhibited by the event? Yes. Was the event unexpected and unavoidable? Yeah.
Yeah, sort of. I mean, I think potentially a power outage is something you should potentially expect at some point in time.
But the particular event, right? Like a tornado is obviously always unexpected and unavoidable, but we do know they're going to happen.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the interesting things about this sort of unexpected and unavoidable, and we're going to get a little bit into some sort of law interpretation here. We say like a tornado's unexpected. If you live in Tornado Alley, presumably tornadoes are not entirely unexpected, but any particular one tornado is unexpected.
Yeah, I think that's what we focus on. And then finally, was the event beyond your reasonable control? Well, yeah, you can't stop the power from going out, but could you have prevented its consequences? Well, of course you could have.
Yep.
You could have a UPS, you could have saved more often, turned autosave on, or done any number of things that are now commonplace and standard for anybody who works in this industry. So that would not be a force majeure event.
At the same time, you sort of look at it and say, when we talk about the idea of a reasonable control, and I'm just going to jump back to Tornado Alley again, your house is destroyed by a tornado because you live in Tornado Alley. Isn't it, within your, reasonably ability to reasonably prevent the consequences to simply not live there or not to build a house there? And again, I think that's one of these things where now we're sort of looking at the law, and I think one of those issues you get into in a lot of legal interpretation is you have these words, but at the same time, you sort of look at them and say, I can find a scenario in which, yes, you could have avoided the consequences. But I think a lot of American jurisprudence in particular, what we're looking at is we recognize that these kind of things can happen, they may happen, but do we expect it to happen right now to this person?
And it's reasonably avoidable, right? Like just telling somebody don't live anywhere where there could possibly be a natural disaster. Well, you have to live somewhere.
Yeah.
And no matter where you go, something's going to go wrong.
There's some form of natural disaster. If it's not tornadoes, it's earthquakes or hurricanes.
So the more classic example would be where you run, say, a banquet hall. You've got a bunch of wedding receptions or events scheduled for the weekend, and then a tornado destroys the building. This is a clear and easy case. There's nothing you could have done.
That's essentially the law school example of what exactly force majeure is. It's an event that's completely beyond your control. And the important thing about it is it's also very clear at that point in time you can't perform. I mean,
Yeah.
the wedding reception requires the banquet hall. You don't have an alternate facility or anything along those lines. What can you do?
Well, turning to the eclipse, in what circumstance could a total eclipse be considered a force majeure event? This is kind of a weird one as I was thinking about this yesterday because, when an eclipse occurs is entirely predictable now.
Yep.
Newtonian mechanics for the movement of the moon are well understood and have been well understood for a long time.
Yep.
The eclipse is unavoidable, but is it unexpected?
Yeah, you have to believe that this is expected. I mean, we know far in advance that it's going to occur. We know exactly where it's going to occur. I mean, let's face it, they've been selling, eclipse viewing goggles for, how many months up until this point in time.
But I think probably the most important aspect of this is I can't think of a contractual obligation that you could not be able to perform because of an eclipse.
Yeah, and again, I suppose there's a possibility of something which would be
you have to have something very time sensitive, right? Like you have to perform something at exactly this time outdoors in the path of totality, and it requires light.
Yeah, and the problem with it is you presumably wouldn't schedule that. That's kind of where you get into that. You can avoid it. Why would you be scheduling?
You just
that
reschedule
event?
it for literally 5 minutes later, and you'd be fine.
Yeah,
So we couldn't come up with much, but flipping this, there's a sort of a related and interesting set of circumstances. I saw a story on USA Today about couples who were married during the eclipse. So here's an interesting puzzle. What if your wedding photographer, or say your officiant, doesn't show and you miss the chance to get your wedding pictures taken during the eclipse or to get married during the eclipse at all? Now, is this force majeure or is this something else?
Well, I think you're probably looking at basically that's an ordinary contract breach. I mean, you don't have the eclipse, the event causing it. Now, part of the reason maybe why didn't they show up? So an example could potentially be, hey, they got in a car wreck on the way down there. One can now argue that the car wreck is itself a force majeure event.
Yeah, exactly. So that one's probably more of an ordinary contract breach. And there's actually a case in law school that's kind of like this, where a photographer doesn't show up, and that one's more focused on damages. You basically get your money back, but I think in that case, the bride had tried to sue to have the entire wedding party brought back in to restage the event and have the pictures taken, and the court said, no, we're not doing that.
Yeah, and particularly in this event, I think the thing you've got is, assuming you want a wedding picture taken during the totality, something along those lines, it's not something which can be restaged again for, at least 5 years, depending on exactly
there's another one coming to Missouri in
Illinois.
2023, I think, 24.
Yeah, 5 years from now, we've got another totality coming across Illinois. It actually is missing Missouri for the most part. It's hitting the sort of bottom part of the
Boot
state.
Heel area.
Yeah, because it's coming up from Mexico, if I remember correctly, and going towards sort of the northeastern corner.
So the types of things that are usually considered force majeure are things like hurricanes and floods, like
any
we're
kind
saying
of
in Houston, any kind of natural disaster. The other major category, I kind of just bucket it together as forms of civil unrest or civil disturbances, like invasions, wars, now acts of terrorism. We used to not put that in contracts, but we do now.
Yep.
Riots, strikes, and you also see in American contracts, especially rebellion, revolution, and insurrection.
Yeah, things we're sort of used to, I guess, as to what we would potentially cause. Now, interesting, we mentioned acts of terrorism. A lot of times acts of terrorism are actually now specifically excluded.
Yeah.
And that's a sort of important thing to keep in mind, where a contract may have a force majeure clause that says the following things are sort of force majeure events, and it's acknowledged. Sometimes acts of terrorism are actually called out individually. Mm-hmm. And I think part of the reason
especially
is
insurance, I think they tend to use riders a lot to cover that.
That's one of the things I've encountered a lot. Like if you actually put on an event, so if you actually get a banquet hall or something along those lines, you're putting on an event and you need to insure the event, they oftentimes won't insure against an act of terrorism. They'll insure against other force majeure events, but they won't insure against the act of terrorism.
We also get into causation problems here, right? So let's say we're having an event here in St. Louis and we're requiring fresh seafood to be flown in from Boston, but there's a terrorist attack in Boston, like say the marathon bombing or something, and the whole city's on lockdown and the stuff can't be flown in. We can't provide the food that we promised for the event, but it's from a terrorism act that took place 1,200 miles away. I don't know how far away Boston is. It's a long ways away, right? So is the terrorism act really responsible for our failure to perform? Are we obligated to find some alternative source?
Yeah, and I think those are where you really get into the issues in conjunction with this.
This is what people hire lawyers for, to figure this out.
And I think one of the key about this is when you're talking about people who are going to be enforcing this kind of force majeure clause, you always have the possibility of the damage is being mitigated by the performance anyway. Usually what people are talking about is a situation where either it couldn't be or the person didn't. So that's a good example is, hey, I'm saying there's going to be seafood flown in. I'm intending to fly the seafood in from Boston. It turns out there's a major event, so it now can't be flown in from Boston. Maybe that's a force majeure event, but now I can get it flown in from Florida, and I do it. And that actually gets us into another contract thing related to it, which is mitigation of damages. Mm-hmm. which is the idea that the person who had this force majeure event occur, they may have been excused from performing under the contract. They may still have owed damages, but now what they've come to is they've said, hey, what I can try to do is
make alternate arrangements,
make it work and mitigate those damages. So now it may be something where, yes, you didn't get quite the food you wanted to. Maybe you're entitled to something.
Maybe you didn't get your main lobster, but you got something delicious from Florida
instead. Yeah.
And you're going to go to a jury and complain about that and say I'm entitled to a bunch of money. I mean, you're entitled to the difference between the performance you got and the performance you were owed. And in a case like that, it's probably not that big of a difference.
Yeah, and a lot of it depends on sort of what is the inconvenience. How important was it? Now, if you were having the Maine Lobster Fest and you'd sold tickets, advertising that people are going to get to come and have Maine lobster, that may be a different issue entirely.
That's when I'd be turning to my insurance policy, I think. Let's talk about some actual things that have happened, and then we'll get into some more fun hypotheticals. 9/11 and the anthrax scare.
Yeah, and 9/11 and the anthrax scare is a really good sort of, I think, piece of the idea of a force majeure because it was such a major event and it shut down so much of the country.
Shut off the stock markets, it grounded air flight. I mean, I wasn't an attorney at the time. I can't even imagine what it was like to try and deal with
was,
everything.
and I distinctly recall, going into somebody's office and, grabbing hold of a TV that was literally to review evidence videos and tuning it in to see what was going on in conjunction with it. The other interesting thing about it, as you're sort of talking to force majeure, and actually as an IP one, it didn't come directly out of 9/11, but it did come out of the anthrax scare. A number of filings that were actually made to the United States Copyright Office because of the security implementation that was put in to deal with the anthrax. The Copyright Office shares a post office with a lot of the United States government, and the filings were actually destroyed.
That's right, because they irradiated them, right?
Yeah, they irradiated them, and it destroyed some of the ink in conjunction with the forms that were submitted.
That's important for copyright, because to get a copyright registration, especially in the early 2000s before the government discovered the internet, you had to do everything by mail, and you had to mail in a specimen or a copy of what you were seeking copyright protection on. And so what they got was a blank sheet of paper. Well, that's not that valuable.
It's a black sheet of paper, actually, because of the irradiation. But one of the interesting things that you sort of bumped into with it as well is they didn't necessarily know which ones had been destroyed. Because, you had sort of various things, and a lot of it was then how does the government deal with that? That's actually a very good example of a force majeure because under the copyright law, you really need the copyright registered. This is not something which is dealt with by damages. You need the copyright registered so you can deal with a secondary lawsuit. If you're now dealing with, hey, I've got somebody ripping off this copyright, but the government hasn't received my filing, and I don't know they haven't received my filing, what do I do?
Yeah. That's a tough one. And did something similar happen with the patent office where they couldn't get stuff on time? And because everything has deadlines, especially at the patent office. And if you miss the deadlines, you lose your patent application.
Yeah, there were some issues associated with it. I think the biggest thing you had with the patent office is because the patent office shut down. As soon as the patent office shuts down, you tend to have the process kick in that basically says deadlines get told because of the shutdown.
Let's talk about some fun hypotheticals. Solar flare. This is something that actually it's not a hypothetical. This happens, and it's been a while, but every once in a while you'll see something in the news about a big solar flare and a bunch of material heading our way that can knock out electronics, can knock out power system. Force majeure event.
I mean, I think you've got to say yes. It has to be. I mean, again,
but I've never seen it called out in a contract. It would just fall into the category of acts of God.
I think you have to call it. Again, I think you have to call it that. It is. Again, are they expected? Yeah, they're expected, but we're not expecting them to be damaging enough to actually cause a problem on Earth, and we don't know when they're going to specifically occur. So, arguably unexpected. Obviously, once it happens, it probably is unavoidable. Now, the issue with it is, and this is, I think, one of those questions you get into. We generally know the solar flare occurs a number of minutes before it actually has any impact on Earth. So one arguably could say that it's not completely unavoidable because, hey, if I've got a server that could be damaged, I potentially can shut systems down. I can
measures to mitigate.
Measures to mitigate.
All right. What about zombie apocalypse or other sort of weird sickness or plague, particularly if unleashed by the government?
Yeah, this is one of those I think is actually a very fun sort of force majeure question because one of the things you bump into is assuming you start talking about a weird sickness or a plague or something like that, you don't really know what it's going to do.
Yeah.
I mean, we talk about zombie apocalypse. There are all sorts of different versions of zombie apocalypse out there. I mean, you have the 28 days later zombie apocalypse. You have the Night of the Living Dead zombie apocalypse. Those are totally different.
Setting aside that there's a lack of capacity for all the various torts committed by the zombies.
That'll be another episode. I have a feeling.
A whole other episode. Yeah, lack of capacity. it presents a strange situation because what category does that fall into? I guess civil unrest maybe to declare martial law.
Yeah, I mean you got to believe it's some form of civil unrest. If you look at it, you can even say it's arguably a rebellion.
Yeah,
I mean I think that's those kind of things as you get into
acts of terror.
The problem with it is acts of terror implies that you're sort of purposely trying to terrorize.
It implies
people.
You have some kind of goal besides eating people.
Yeah, you're trying to cause terror. I think is usually the expectation of acts of terror, whereas presumably zombies are eating to survive. But yeah, you get some weird sort of things when you talk about these. The other thing, and we'd mentioned this previously before having the show, one of the problems you get into as well with the zombie apocalypse is, let's face it, if it's that bad, is there any functioning legal system anyway?
Yeah, and that actually happened during the Reconstruction era. Shortly after the Civil War, most of the government institutions in the South were shut down, and there were cases where literally there were no courthouses open. A lot of the areas were still under martial law, and there were still people out going about their lives and trying to enforce agreements and make their society work, and there's no functioning courthouse to enforce a contract. So, and that got into really weird, like constitutional law and federalism questions about if the government's not providing a form of government, because it's in the Constitution. The federal government will ensure all the states provide a Republican form of government. Can you sue the federal government at that point?
Yeah, and there's the interesting thing about it is that itself a force majeure? Do you actually have a force majeure causing the issue that you can't enforce a contract? So, I mean, we've talked about the idea of acts of terrorism, something like that. What if the United States Supreme Court is knocked out?
Yeah, then what?
Now we have the issue of, you've got a case pending in front of the United States Supreme Court, which has an effect. You arguably have a force majeure event that you can't get that case heard.
How about an asteroid impact? This doesn't have to be like a planet-killing asteroid, but just something big enough to do a lot of damage.
Yeah.
I mean, that seems like a clear force majeure, but we track asteroids pretty well, I think. I mean, we track a couple thousand of them at least.
That's also one where we presumably would know.
Probably would know,
advance notice. Now, I think the issue with it is, and as people have talked about, in conjunction with a lot of the asteroid scanning things, that notice may not be very long just because we can't scan a lot of the sky.
Yeah, and then I mean, how do you mitigate that? I mean, I think whether you can mitigate the consequences is a pretty tough question to answer.
A lot of that depends probably on what exactly is, how big is the asteroid, stuff
where's
like
it
that, and where's
hit?
it going to hit. If it's going to hit in the Mojave Desert, you probably can get everybody out of the way of it.
Yep.
It's going to hit in an ocean. You may have some secondary environmental effects.
Tsunami,
basically. Tsunami, something like that. What can you really do?
Well, this is the one I liked the most. We talked about alien invasion, but I think just the fact of alien contact, if at some point we have clear contact from extraterrestrial intelligence, would that alone be enough to be considered a force majeure event?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. And the reason I think it's so interesting is because it doesn't really have a direct impact on any of these contracts or anything else.
No, but it fundamentally changes everything we think about our place in the universe.
I mean, and it would have such a major impact on the functioning of not just the United States, but every country around the world. What would happen because of this? And I think part of it is the fear of what exactly is the alien contact. I mean, at the point in time we make first contact, we have a close encounters of the third kind type of thing. We don't know if they're friendly. We don't know if they're not, stuff like that. And it's, so much of, I think, science fiction movies related to alien contact is a lot of the fear of are they friendly or not. One that's, whatever you think of the movie, I think is actually very well played out in Independence Day.
Yep.
Because, in Independence Day, it's the idea of, hey, are these guys friendly? There's a lot of people coming to welcome them.
There's all these attempts to contact them, and which end bloodily.
And it ends very badly. And one of my favorite scenes actually in that movie, and I always joke about it as I would have been right along with her, is the character in it who runs out and is standing on top of, I think it's the Chrysler building with the sign, welcome, alien
she was in
benefactors.
L.A. That was the girl in L.A. that was out there.
It was in L.A., okay. That does that and then, promptly gets blown up when, the thing opens and destroys the building. And it's one of those where I think that's a sort of great presentation of we don't know at that point in time what kind of an effect this is going to have. So your question is would this almost be decided retroactively? Where, if we have
by whoever's left.
By whoever's left. Well, but assuming it is a friendly contact, it's something which is not malicious, and maybe it is, it's just we receive a radio message, so there's nobody here, it's something we need to respond to, it still would potentially completely alter the functioning of Earth. But what does, retroactively we would look at it and say, what happened on that day? And there is a bit of that. I think you have force majeure sometimes being decided retroactively, where we looked at an event and said, hey, we didn't think that was going to be as big of a deal as it ended up being.
Well, that's how these things come up procedurally. Somebody doesn't perform, they get sued for it, and the person didn't perform says, well, there was a force majeure, and you try to shoehorn whatever happened into the buckets of categories set out in the contract.
Yeah. The other question I think you bump into is exactly what is alien contact? I mean, it's not really civil unrest. It may cause civil unrest, but it wouldn't actually be civil unrest in
Yeah.
itself. It probably isn't a natural disaster, assuming we say this is a friendly contact. And again, I try to treat it as like we just receive a radio signal, which has basically no impact on us other than indicating we are not alone.
Yeah, I've found. Tell me how you feel about this, but becoming a lawyer has ruined a lot of these kind of movies for me. Like, I can't watch them without thinking, how would this play out? 'Cause, like, things happen. I see, like, an asteroid hits a building, and I'm just like, ooh, gosh, the insurance claims, you know?
Yeah, well, that's I don't say much, but more to action movies with, okay, now that we've destroyed the perpetual, fruit cart in conjunction with it, does the guy who owns the fruit cart have a cause of action against the police car that just ran into it? It's sort of things like that.
Like, all these movies involve just cities being leveled. And I always think, like, someone has to clean up after all of this. Like, how do you not hold these people responsible?
It's interesting enough that they've never really made a movie having those kind of, like, fallout impacts. I mean, as bad as I think you can say some of the movies are, and admittedly I'm a huge fan of the franchise, the Transformers movies at least tried in some respects to deal with the aftermath.
Yeah.
And, things like that. X-Men, I think, did as well, kind of the idea of trying to deal with a bit of the aftermath.
One of the Avengers ones kind of had another movie that talked about showed some scenes of cleaning up afterwards. But anyway, we're running long, so we're going to move on to some listener questions. Our first question comes from Adam K. In Minnesota via Facebook. And Adam, I'm going to paraphrase your lengthy missive. Adam says, I am hurt and dismayed that you left out the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. He's talking about the Jedi episode, and especially the Hobby Lobby case, which just about discards entirely the notion that a belief need be well ensconced before one can refuse a neutral demand on it. There is nothing in that case that would prevent a Jedi from refusing to provide insurance for genetic testing of babies because it might interfere with the midichlorians, as long as it's sincere. And Adam says, otherwise keep up the great work. So, by way of background, Adam and I go way back. He's a labor lawyer and knows way more about this particular aspect than I do. The Religious Freedom Restoration Act is obviously a congressional act, and Kirk and I were talking more about just classic First Amendment free exercise principles. But Adam's point is that the Supreme Court has since interpreted this act to basically provide even more protection than what the First Amendment does, which sort of effectively makes the free exercise clause superfluous under current law.
Yeah, I think, the thing you really get into in conjunction with this is that we have secondary law now coming into play to basically say, hey, there's specific protections associated with this.
It's kind of unusual, right? Usually we're fighting with Congress and saying, no, you can't infringe our rights. This is a case where they're expanding them even further.
Yeah, and I think the other thing to keep in mind in conjunction with, and I sort of, I pointed this out sort of previously, it still does have a lot of this aspects of sincerity, which is one of the things we were really trying to get across in the Jedi episode, was what exactly does it mean to sincerely believe this? I mean,
you still have the evidentiary problems, too.
Yeah,
like,
and
how do
the
you
evidentiary problems associated with it. But it is, definitely, I think, a good point to bring up and something we didn't.
Yeah. And I have to say, two demerits to Adam for mentioning midichlorians at all.
Oh, I mean, that may be more than two demerits. I mean, that's, we all know that midichlorians do not actually exist, even if the Force does.
I refuse to acknowledge that that's canon.
Yes.
Okay, our second question comes to Krista M. via Facebook. She says, I was shocked when Ben mentioned that Wizards of the Coast had a patent on the card tapping mechanism in Magic the Gathering. Now that the patent has expired, how might they protect the way their game is played to prevent copycats? What's to stop copycats from coming in and using the same rules with different art under a different name? Well, this has kind of happened. Have you played Hearthstone, Kirk?
Yeah, I've definitely played Hearthstone. If you do not know, Ben and I play Hearthstone a lot.
We love Hearthstone.
And things like that. I've also played a number of other true collectible card games. I played Marvel Overpower. I played Doom Trooper back in the day. I think we both played the Star Wars game. I played the Star Trek game. One of my favorite ones, and I'll go ahead and call out a little company you probably never heard of, was a card game called On the Edge.
I used to play Spellfire when that was popular for a very short amount of time.
Also wrote a really rare one, if anybody remembers Wyvern.
I do not. Well, anyway, Krista, that's our next episode. We're going to talk about game mechanics in episode 8. That was going to be this episode, but then the eclipse happened and Houston happened.
We had a force majeure event.
We had a force majeure event that forced us to change our schedule. So next episode, we're going to talk about game mechanics, how you can protect them, or more specifically, why you can't for the most part. But that's coming up next. So, Kirk, I think that's all we got for today.
I think that's all we got for today.
All right. If you have a question, you can ask us on Twitter at LGGPod, or you can email us at LGGpodcast@gmail.com. You can also talk to us on our Facebook page. Search for Lawyer's Guide to the Galaxy. And if you like what you hear, please give us a review. We really, really appreciate that. It helps people find us. 5 stars, however many stars. And like I said, next time we're going to talk about video game mechanics. And we'll get into that in the next episode.
Sounds good.
All right. Thanks all.
The views expressed by the participants of this program are their own and do not represent the views of, nor are they endorsed by Lewis Rice LLC, its officers, directors, employees, agents, representatives, shareholders, and subsidiaries. None of the content should be considered legal advice. As always, consult a lawyer. This podcast was produced and recorded at Cool Fire Studios in St. Louis, Missouri.